In 1783, Britain lost a third of its empire in a single stroke. Every newspaper in London predicted ruin. Every rival in Europe was waiting for the collapse. Yet within 30 years, Britain controlled more of the Earth's surface than any nation in human history, and within 50, it ruled an empire 4 times the size of the one it had just lost. The question is not how Britain survived losing America. The question is how losing America made Britain the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. In this documentary, we'll trace the hidden logic of defeat and uncover how the greatest humiliation in British history became the foundation of its greatest triumph. September 3rd, 1783. In a modest hotel on the Rue Jacob in Paris, British and American diplomats bent over a table and scratched their names onto a document that would reshape the world. The Treaty of Paris was complete. 13 colonies, stretching from the rocky shores of Massachusetts to the sweltering lowlands of Georgia, were gone. A third of the entire British Empire surrendered with the stroke of a pen. The news reached London like a physical blow. Here was a nation that had spent the better part of a century building something extraordinary, a web of trade and territory that circled the Atlantic, only to watch it fracture after 8 years of grinding, expensive, humiliating war. The surrender at Yorktown 2 years earlier had broken the military back of the campaign, but this document made it permanent and legal and undeniable. What did contemporaries believe would follow? Ruin, quite simply. The predictions were not cautious or measured. They were apocalyptic. Horace Walpole, the writer and political observer, had already declared that Britain was finished as a great power. The opposition in Parliament spoke of national disgrace. Merchants feared the collapse of Atlantic trade. Economists warned that the loss of American markets would hollow out British industry. Even King George III, a man not given to despair, reportedly drafted a letter of abdication. So certain was he that his reign had presided over irreversible catastrophe. And the numbers seemed to justify the gloom. Britain had borrowed massively to fight the war. The national debt had swollen to nearly £250 million, a figure that staggered contemporaries. Tens of thousands of soldiers and sailors needed to be demobilized. Loyalists, those Americans who had remained faithful to the crown, flooded into Britain and its remaining colonies as refugees, a visible and daily reminder of defeat. Yet history had other plans entirely. Within a single generation, something astonishing occurred. The empire that had just lost its most prized possessions began to grow at a pace and on a scale that no one in that Paris hotel room could have imagined. India, which had been a commercial enterprise run by a private trading company, became the jewel of a reconstituted empire. Australia, unknown to Europeans barely 2 decades earlier, received its first British settlers in 1788, just 5 years after the treaty signing. The scramble for territory in Africa, in Asia, in the Pacific was accelerating. By the middle of the 19th century, Britain would govern roughly a quarter of the Earth's land surface and a third of its people. How does a nation lose a third of its empire on a Tuesday and spend the following century building the largest the world has ever seen? The answer is not simple, and it is not comfortable. It involves hard lessons absorbed from defeat, strategic reinvention, a revolution in economics, and a transformation in how the British understood what empire was actually for. Because the loss of America did not just wound Britain, it changed Britain. It forced a reckoning with questions of governance, trade, and power that the comfortable prosperity of the mid-18th century had allowed the nation to ignore. The 13 colonies were gone, but in their absence, a different kind of empire, more commercial, more calculating, and ultimately far more durable, began to take shape. To understand how that transformation happened, we must first understand what Britain actually lost in 1783 and why those who predicted disaster were so magnificently, so instructively wrong. By the middle of the 18th century, Britain had constructed something that its architects could barely have imagined 100 years before. It was not an empire in the ancient sense, built on conquest and tribute. It was a machine humming and interconnected, designed to generate wealth on a scale the world had never witnessed. The engine of that machine was mercantilism, the governing economic philosophy of the age. The logic was elegant in its simplicity. Colonies existed to serve the mother country. They would produce raw materials. Britain would manufacture and sell them, and the profits would flow back across the Atlantic to London. Parliament enforced this arrangement through the Navigation Acts, a series of laws stretching back to 1651, which required that colonial goods travel only in British ships to British ports, sold through British merchants. The system was not subtle. It was not meant to be. What did it produce? Tobacco from Virginia and Maryland, filling the warehouses of Bristol and Glasgow, rice and indigo from the Carolinas, and above all, sugar from the Caribbean islands, Barbados, Jamaica, Antigua, where vast plantations worked by enslaved Africans generated profits that made their owners among the richest people on earth. By the 1760s, the Atlantic trade accounted for roughly a third of all British commerce. The 13 mainland colonies alone represented a market of some 2.5 million consumers, buying British manufactured goods at a rate that kept workshops in the Midlands and counting houses in London permanently busy. It was, by any measure, a stunning achievement. But it rested on a tension that nobody had quite resolved. The colonists were British subjects who had, over a century and more of relative freedom, developed their own political habits. Distance had been their greatest liberty. London was 6 to 8 weeks away by sea. Instructions arrived late. Crises were resolved locally. Colonial assemblies, elected bodies that controlled taxation and local legislation, had accumulated genuine power simply because there was nobody nearby to stop them. This arrangement, later called salutary neglect, had been less a policy than an accident, the pragmatic result of governing vast territories from an island in the North Atlantic. The relationship between Parliament in Westminster and these colonial assemblies was consequently murky, unexplored, and never formally defined. Parliament assumed its supremacy was absolute. The colonists assumed their assemblies guaranteed their rights as Englishmen. Both sides believed their position was self-evident. Neither had been forced to test the assumption. For decades, that ambiguity had not mattered. The trade flourished. The colonies grew. Britain prospered. The machine worked, and nobody asked too carefully how. But empires, like machines, develop faults along their seams. The question of who held ultimate authority, Parliament or the colonial assemblies, had been deferred, not answered. It would take a war, a debt crisis, and a decision to finally enforce the rules everyone had been quietly ignoring to bring that fault line to the surface. In the summer of 1756, Britain stumbled into a war it had not fully chosen against an alliance it could not easily defeat. France, Austria, Russia, and Spain, between them, commanded the greater part of continental Europe. Facing them, Britain stood alongside Prussia, a single Protestant kingdom on the North German plain whose survival was far from guaranteed. By any conventional military calculus, the odds were poor. William Pitt the Elder did not accept conventional calculations. As Secretary of State, Pitt reoriented British strategy around a single audacious insight. Europe was not where empires were won. The real prize lay in the oceans, The trade routes, the colonies that fed the great commercial machine described in Counting Houses from London to Bristol, let Prussia bleed French armies on the Rhine. Britain would strike everywhere else simultaneously, in Canada, in the Caribbean, in West Africa, in India. It was a global war conceived with global ambition. The results were staggering. In September of 1759, British forces under General James Wolfe climbed the cliffs below the Plains of Abraham and faced the French army of the Marquis de Montcalm outside the walls of Quebec. Both commanders would die in the battle that followed. Quebec fell within the hour. Within a year, Montreal had surrendered. French Canada, the vast northern empire that had hemmed the British colonies against the Atlantic seaboard for generations, ceased to exist as a rival power. That single year, 1759, would be called the Year of Victories. Victories accumulated so rapidly that London church bells rang until the ringers grew exhausted. In the same 12 months, Britain seized Guadeloupe in the Caribbean, defeated the French fleet at Lagos and Quiberon Bay, and secured its position in India at the Battle of Minden. The world was tilting on its axis. The Treaty of Paris, signed in February of 1763, formalized the new order. France surrendered Canada entirely. Spain, which had entered the war late on the French side, ceded Florida. Britain now controlled the entire eastern half of North America from Hudson Bay to the Gulf of Mexico. It was the most complete strategic victory any European power had achieved in living memory. But what did it cost? The national debt, already considerable before the fighting began, had nearly doubled during the war years to £133 million. The interest payments alone consumed more than half of all government revenue. Britain had purchased its empire on credit, and the bill had come due. Someone would have to pay. And then, almost immediately, the problems multiplied. In the spring of 1763, Pontiac, an Ottawa war leader of exceptional political skill, forged an unprecedented alliance of native nations across the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley. Having lost their French counterweight, the tribes now faced unchecked British expansion. Pontiac's forces attacked 8 British forts in coordinated strikes, capturing 7 of them and pushing the frontier into violent chaos. 2,000 settlers died. Thousands more fled. The uprising demonstrated with brutal clarity that controlling Canada on a map and controlling the land itself were entirely different propositions. The British government's response was swift. In October of 1763, the Crown issued a proclamation drawing a line along the Appalachian Mountains. West of that line, colonial settlement was forbidden. The territories would be reserved for native peoples, at least until proper treaties could be arranged. British regulars would enforce the boundary. It was a rational response to an urgent crisis. But in the 13 colonies, it was received as something else entirely. Settlers who had fought and sacrificed in the war now found themselves legally barred from the Western lands they had imagined as their reward. Land speculators, including some of the most influential men in Virginia and Massachusetts, watched their investments evaporate. The proclamation line did not close the West. It simply made the Crown's authority feel, for the first time, like a constraint rather than a protection. Britain had won everything. And in winning, it had created a problem that no treaty could resolve. George Grenville was not a glamorous man. No one wrote poems about his speeches or packed galleries to hear him speak. But in April of 1763, when he became Prime Minister, glamour was not what Britain needed. It needed an accountant. And Grenville, methodical, humorless, and relentlessly thorough, was precisely that. He opened the ledgers and stared at what the war had left behind. £133 million in national debt, interest payments swallowing more than half of all government revenue, And now, stationed across the vast new territories of North America, an army of 10,000 regular soldiers whose annual cost ran to roughly £350,000. Someone had to pay for those soldiers. The question Grenville put to Parliament was blunt. Why should that someone be exclusively the British taxpayer? The argument seemed reasonable from Westminster. The colonists were, after all, the primary beneficiaries of those troops. They lived behind the shield the redcoats provided. They farmed land made safe by British arms. Meanwhile, the average British citizen paid roughly 26 shillings per year in taxes. The average colonial American paid barely 1 shilling. The disparity was not a matter of opinion. It was arithmetic. Grenville's solution arrived in the spring of 1764 in the form of the Sugar Act. It was, in one sense, a modest proposal. The existing Molasses Act of 1733 had levied a tax of 6 pence per gallon on foreign molasses imported into the colonies. Almost nobody had ever paid it. The rate was set deliberately high to protect British Caribbean sugar interests, and colonial merchants had responded by bribing customs officials and sailing around the law entirely. Grenville halved the rate to 3 pence, but he paired it with something that changed everything: enforcement. New Vice Admiralty courts, operating without juries, would now hear smuggling cases. Royal Navy ships were authorized to stop and search colonial vessels. Customs officials who had spent decades looking the other way were suddenly given teeth. The message was clear. Britain was no longer asking. It was collecting. The colonial reaction was fierce, but its nature is worth noting. In 1764, the fury was primarily economic rather than constitutional. Merchants in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia understood immediately what rigorous enforcement meant for their trade networks. Much of colonial commerce had been quietly built on circumventing British trade law. Molasses from the French Caribbean was cheaper, and New England rum distillers had been buying it for decades. The Sugar Act threatened to dismantle a commercial ecosystem that had grown up in the shadow of deliberate neglect. The pamphlets multiplied. The assemblies petitioned, but the language of 1764 was the language of hardship and commercial injury, not yet the language of liberty and tyranny. That transformation would come. For now, the colonists argued that the tax would ruin trade, drain hard currency from the colonies, and punish enterprise. They were not yet arguing in any systematic way that Parliament had no right to tax them at all. Grenville heard the complaints and remained unmoved. He was solving an arithmetic problem, and the numbers still didn't balance. The Sugar Act alone would raise perhaps £45,000 annually, a fraction of what the American military establishment required. If the colonists wanted to object, they could propose an alternative. None came. So Grenville kept turning pages. Somewhere in those ledgers was a larger solution. Something that would reach not just the merchants at the docks, but every colonist who signed a document, filed a legal paper, or bought a newspaper. He had already begun drafting it. What came next would do what the Sugar Act had not. It would transform an argument about money into an argument about power itself. What Grenville had been drafting was the Stamp Act, passed by Parliament in March of 1765. It was, in scope, breathtaking. Every legal document in the American colonies would now require an official stamp. Newspapers, pamphlets, diplomas, playing cards, dice, contracts, wills, even marriage licenses. The stamps ranged in cost from a halfpenny to £10, but the price was almost beside the point. This was not a duty on imported goods arriving at a harbor. This was a tax reaching into the daily life of every colonial American, regardless of where they lived or how they earned their living. The reaction was something Parliament had not anticipated and could not quite comprehend. Within weeks, the phrase was everywhere, spoken in taverns, printed in colonial newspapers, read aloud at town meetings from Massachusetts to South Carolina. No taxation without representation. The argument was constitutional at its core. Parliament could not rightfully tax people who had no voice in its chambers. The colonists sent no members to Westminster. They were, in the formulation that spread like fire through the Atlantic world, being taxed by a body in which they held no seat. From Westminster, the counterargument seemed obvious. Most Britons did not directly elect members of Parliament either. The great cities of Manchester and Birmingham had no dedicated representatives, yet still fell under Parliament's authority. This was the doctrine of virtual representation, the idea that Parliament spoke for the interests of all British subjects everywhere, not merely those in particular constituencies. To British minds, this was settled constitutional principle. To colonial minds, it was an insult dressed up as a theory. The protests were not merely rhetorical. In Boston in August of 1765, a mob tore apart the home of stamp distributor Andrew Oliver and later demolished the mansion of Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson. Similar scenes played out up and down the eastern seaboard. Stamp distributors resigned their posts before the act even took effect, intimidated into silence by crowds that had given themselves the name the Sons of Liberty. When November 1st arrived, the date the act was to begin, there was almost no one left willing to sell a stamp. In October of that year, delegates from 9 colonies gathered in New York at what became known as the Stamp Act Congress, the first coordinated intercolonial political body in American history. They produced a Declaration of Rights, insisting that the power of taxation belonged only to their own representative assemblies. The colonies were not simply complaining. They were beginning to organize. They were also beginning to squeeze. Colonial merchants signed non-importation agreements, pledging to stop buying British goods until the act was repealed. The effect on British manufacturers was immediate and sharp. Wool workers in Yorkshire, glassmakers in Bristol, merchants in London began petitioning Parliament themselves, not out of sympathy for colonial constitutional arguments, but because their order books were emptying. By early 1766, the Grenville ministry had already fallen, replaced by the Marquess of Rockingham. Rockingham, facing pressure from British commercial interests as much as from colonial fury, moved to repeal the Stamp Act. Parliament did so in March of 1766. Church bells rang in Boston. Colonists celebrated in the streets. But Parliament had no intention of surrendering the principle. On the very same day it repealed the Stamp Act, it passed the Declaratory Act, asserting in plain terms that Parliament possessed full authority to make laws binding on the American colonies in all cases whatsoever. The colonists largely celebrated and ignored it. Parliament largely celebrated and meant it. Here was the fault line that would never close. The colonists had fought a constitutional argument and believed they had won. Parliament had made a tactical retreat while insisting it had conceded nothing. Two sides looked at the same moment and drew opposite conclusions about what it meant. The crisis had passed. But the deeper question, the one about sovereign authority over 3 million people an ocean away, remained entirely unresolved. And in London, a new ministry was already searching for another way to make the arithmetic work. The man who stepped forward with that new approach was Charles Townshend, Chancellor of the Exchequer in the ministry of William Pitt, brilliant, erratic, and possessed of a showman's instinct for the dramatic. Townshend believed he had identified the solution hiding in plain sight. The colonists had objected to internal taxes, duties collected within the colonies themselves. Very well. He would tax them from the outside, placing duties on goods arriving at colonial ports. Tea, glass, paper, paint, lead. The revenue would flow before the goods ever cleared customs. In 1767, Parliament passed the Townshend Revenue Acts, and their architect congratulated himself on his cleverness. He had missed the point entirely. The colonists had never drawn that distinction in the way Townshend imagined. Their objection was not to where the tax was collected. It was to who collected it and why. A parliament in which they had no representation had no right to reach into their pockets at all, whether at the harbor gate or at the kitchen table. The philosopher John Dickinson made this argument with quiet precision in his widely read letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania, published in the winter of 1767. Taxation without consent, he wrote, was taxation without legitimacy, regardless of its form. The letters circulated through every colony. The response was familiar in shape but sharper in intensity. Non-importation agreements spread again, this time more broadly coordinated than before. Boston, New York, and Philadelphia merchants pledged to refuse British goods. British exports to the colonies fell dramatically. The economic pressure, once again, bit hard on the other side of the Atlantic. Then Massachusetts escalated. In February of 1768, the Colonial Assembly approved the Massachusetts Circular Letter, drafted largely by Samuel Adams. It called on other colonial assemblies to join in opposing the Townshend Acts and argued that taxation without representation violated the British Constitution itself. London's response was swift and revealing. The Colonial Secretary, Lord Hillsborough, ordered the Massachusetts Assembly to rescind the letter. When the Assembly voted 92-17 to refuse, Parliament dissolved it outright. The number 92 became a rallying symbol up and down the seaboard. Faced with what it described as a state of near rebellion in Massachusetts, the British government made a decision that would prove consequential. In the autumn of 1768, 2 regiments of British regulars arrived in Boston Harbor and marched through the city's streets. Soldiers were quartered in private homes and public buildings. To the people of Boston, this was not protection. It was occupation. The tension that settled over the city during those months was the kind that does not dissipate on its own. It required only a spark. On the evening of the 5th of March, 1770, a crowd gathered outside the Custom House on King Street, taunting a small group of soldiers. The confrontation collapsed into chaos. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead or dying, including a mixed-race dockworker named Crispus Attucks. The silversmith Paul Revere produced an engraving of the scene almost immediately, depicting the British soldiers in a disciplined line, firing into a helpless crowd at the order of their officer. It was not an accurate rendering. It was a devastating one. Copies spread through the colonies within weeks. The Boston Massacre, as it was instantly and deliberately named, became the image of British tyranny pressed onto the American imagination. The Townshend duties were partially repealed just days after the massacre, though Parliament kept the tax on tea as a matter of principle. The pattern was becoming unmistakable. Crisis, concession, provocation. Each cycle left the relationship more damaged than before, and the colonists more practiced in the art of resistance. For a brief moment, an uneasy quiet settled over the colonies. But the question of tea remained, and with it, the question of who truly governed. 3,000 miles from the arguments in colonial taverns and assembly halls, another set of minds was wrestling with the same crisis and reaching entirely different conclusions. In the chambers of Westminster, the colonial dispute was not primarily a question of justice or grievance. It was a question of constitution. And on that ground, the majority of British lawmakers felt themselves on unshakable footing. George III was not the tyrant that Revere's engraving suggested. He was, by the standards of his age, a conscientious constitutional monarch who genuinely believed he was defending something precious: the integrity of parliamentary sovereignty. To George, the empire was a single political body, and Parliament was its governing mind. The idea that one part of that body could exempt itself from parliamentary authority was not merely inconvenient. It was incoherent. If the colonists were British subjects, which everyone agreed they were, then Parliament governed them. There was no middle ground that made legal sense. Lord North, who became Prime Minister in 1770, understood the politics more cynically but arrived at the same destination. A shrewd and often underestimated manager of parliamentary opinion, North believed that conceding the principle of colonial self-taxation would unravel the entire imperial framework. Ireland would be next. Then the Caribbean colonies. The empire would dissolve not through rebellion but through precedent. His position was pragmatic rather than passionate, but it was firm. The tragedy is that Parliament contained men who saw further. Edmund Burke, speaking with a lawyer's precision and a philosopher's range, argued that the rights of Englishmen traveled with Englishmen wherever they settled. He did not dispute Parliament's theoretical authority. He questioned the wisdom of exercising it. Governing a free people through coercion, he warned the House of Commons was governing them not at all. William Pitt, the Earl of Chatham, who had overseen British victory in the 7 Years' War and understood the colonies as few in London did, rose from genuine illness to make similar arguments with trembling urgency. Charles James Fox, younger and more combative, attacked the ministry's approach as both morally bankrupt and strategically foolish. They were eloquent. They were largely ignored, because the counterargument was not merely political. It was psychological. To grant the colonial position was to admit that Parliament, the institution that had toppled kings and built the modern British state, had exceeded its authority over its own subjects. For men who had inherited a constitutional settlement bought in blood, that admission felt like surrender. Compromise in this framing was not statesmanship. It was capitulation dressed in careful language. There was something else too, something rarely stated plainly in the parliamentary record but visible between its lines. The colonists in British eyes had prospered enormously under the protection of the Royal Navy and the security of British arms. The 7 Years' War had been fought partly on their behalf at enormous cost to the British Treasury. Now they refused to contribute even modest sums to their own defense. The grievance was real, even if the response was catastrophically mishandled. By the early 1770s, the political arithmetic at Westminster was not close. Burke and Chatham and Fox could fill the debate with brilliant argument. They could not fill the lobbies with votes. The governing majority believed, with genuine conviction, that they were defending a principle without which the empire could not survive. They were right about the principle. They were catastrophically wrong about what its defense would cost. The uneasy quiet in the colonies would not last. Across the Atlantic, the question of tea, and the deeper question it represented, was moving toward a harbor in Boston and a reckoning that no one in Westminster had fully prepared for. On the night of December 16, 1773, 116 men disguised as Mohawk Indians moved quietly through the streets of Boston toward Griffin's Wharf. What followed took less than 3 hours. By morning, 342 chests of East India Company tea lay at the bottom of Boston Harbor, 10,000 pounds worth of property destroyed without a single act of wider violence. How had it come to this? The immediate trigger was almost absurdly technical. The East India Company, Britain's great trading giant, was drowning in debt and sitting on 17 million pounds of unsold tea. Parliament's solution was the Tea Act of 1773, which actually lowered the price colonists paid for tea while simultaneously granting the company a monopoly on its distribution. By any rational measure, colonists were getting a better deal, but they saw through the arithmetic immediately. Cheap tea with a tax attached was still taxed tea, and a company monopoly would strangle local merchants who had built livelihoods around the existing trade. The principle of taxation without representation had not changed. Parliament had simply wrapped it in a lower price and assumed no one would notice. The colonists noticed. What followed in that Boston harbor was not simply vandalism. It was a carefully organized political act, one that destroyed property while deliberately sparing lives and ships. The men responsible swept the decks clean when they were done. They were making a point, not starting a war. Britain, however, heard a different message entirely. Lord North's government responded with a set of measures so severe that the colonists gave them their own name, the Intolerable Acts. Passed in the spring of 1774, they closed the port of Boston until the destroyed tea was paid for, stripped Massachusetts of its elected council, allowed royal officials accused of crimes to be tried in Britain rather than the colonies, and expanded the quartering of British troops in colonial homes. Each act, in Westminster's view, was a proportionate response to lawlessness. Taken together, they read in Boston, Philadelphia, and Virginia as a blueprint for the destruction of self-government. Then came the Quebec Act, passed the same year and immediately swept into the same furious conversation. Designed to govern Britain's newly acquired French-Canadian territories, it extended Quebec's boundaries south to the Ohio River, cutting off colonial ambitions for westward expansion. Worse, it granted official recognition to the Catholic Church in Quebec. To Protestant colonists who had grown up hearing sermons about papal tyranny, the image of a Catholic province pressing down from the north felt like encirclement. The fear was not entirely rational. The politics of it were devastating. The coercive acts did something that years of pamphlets and protests had failed to do. They unified the colonies. In September of 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. The moderate voices who had dominated earlier assemblies, men who believed the relationship with Britain could still be repaired, found themselves crowded out. Not because the radicals seized control by force, but because events had made moderation look naive. When a government closes your port and dismantles your legislature, what exactly is there left to negotiate? The Congress agreed on a coordinated boycott of British goods and, crucially, agreed to meet again if grievances remained unaddressed. That second meeting, already penciled into the colonial calendar, would convene in May of 1775. By then, the shooting would already have started. Britain had misread nearly every signal. The tea destruction was not the tantrum of an ungovernable mob. It was the considered action of a colonial society that had exhausted its patience with legal channels. The coercive acts were meant to isolate Massachusetts and frighten the other colonies into compliance. Instead, they confirmed every warning that colonial radicals had spent a decade making. London had shown its hand, and the hand contained no offer of partnership. The question now was no longer whether the relationship could be saved. It was whether anyone on either side of the Atlantic still believed it could be. By the spring of 1775, General Thomas Gage sat in Boston with an unenviable assignment. As both military commander and royal governor of Massachusetts, he was being asked to restore order in a colony that had already decided order on British terms was no longer acceptable. London's instructions were characteristically confident and characteristically uninformed. Suppress the rebellion. Disarm the troublemakers. Do it quickly. What Gage could see from his position, and what London could not, was that the troublemakers were everywhere. They were organized, and they had been quietly stockpiling weapons for months. Intelligence reached him that a significant cache of colonial arms had been assembled at Concord, 18 miles from Boston. On the night of April 18, 1775, Gage dispatched roughly 700 regulars under Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith with orders to seize and destroy those supplies. It was meant to be a swift, silent operation. Paul Revere and William Dawes had other plans. By the time the British column reached Lexington at dawn on April 19th, Captain John Parker and approximately 77 militiamen were waiting on the town green. What happened next remains disputed. A shot rang out, and then volleys followed. When the smoke cleared, 8 colonists lay dead and 10 were wounded. The British marched on. At Concord's North Bridge, they met something different. Hundreds of militia had gathered, and when British soldiers opened fire, the militia fired back with discipline and effect. The regulars began their retreat to Boston, and that retreat became a running nightmare. Colonial fighters, firing from behind walls and trees along the road, harassed the column for 16 miles. By the end of the day, the British had suffered nearly 300 casualties. The colonists had lost fewer than 100. The news traveled faster than anyone in London thought possible. By June, the two sides met again at a promontory above Charlestown called Breed's Hill, remembered ever since as Bunker Hill. The British took the position, as they took Lexington Green, because their commanders ordered frontal assaults up an exposed slope against entrenched defenders. They succeeded on the third attempt. The cost was staggering. Over 200 British soldiers killed and more than 800 wounded, against a force of volunteers who eventually ran out of ammunition and withdrew on their own terms. It was technically a British victory. It felt like something else entirely. In London, the initial response was a kind of stubborn disbelief. King George III and his ministers had long maintained that the rebellion was the work of a radical minority, that ordinary colonists remained loyal subjects who simply needed to be separated from their agitators. Bunker Hill made that story difficult to sustain. Those were not desperate criminals on that hill. They were farmers and tradesmen who had nearly destroyed a professional army. That same month, the Second Continental Congress made a decision that would transform a collection of colonial militias into something that looked, increasingly, like a nation at war. They appointed George Washington of Virginia as commander of the Continental Army. The choice was partly military, partly political. Washington brought dignity, discipline, and Southern credibility to what had so far been a largely New England affair. He would need all of it. What London had expected to end in weeks was settling into something neither side had fully prepared for. A police action had become a war, and a war was becoming something that might require an entirely new political vocabulary to describe. The question of independence still hung unspoken, but in the summer of 1775, silence on that subject was growing harder to maintain. Fighting a war 3,000 miles from home was not simply a military problem. It was a mathematical one. Every cartridge fired by a British soldier in Massachusetts had to be manufactured in England, loaded onto a ship, carried across the Atlantic, and delivered to the front before it could be used. The same was true of every coat, every cannon, every pound of biscuit. The British Army was, in effect, a machine that could only run on fuel shipped from another continent, and in 1775, no army in history had ever attempted logistics on this scale. The numbers were staggering. Supplying an army of 30,000 men across the Atlantic required roughly 150 supply ships operating continuously. Winds and weather could add weeks or months to the crossing. Provisions spoiled. Ships sank. And while London debated requisition orders, soldiers in Boston were already rationing food. The empire that had defeated France and Spain was about to discover that geography was a more patient enemy than either. To compensate for the sheer scale of the problem, the British government turned to a solution that would cost them something they could not ship across any ocean: public sympathy. George III, unable to raise enough willing British recruits quickly enough, negotiated contracts with several German principalities to hire professional soldiers, most of them from the Landgraviate of Hesse-Kassel. Approximately 30,000 of these soldiers, collectively called Hessians by the colonists, would serve in America throughout the war. Militarily, they were competent and experienced. Politically, the decision was a catastrophe. In pamphlets and taverns across the colonies, the hiring of foreign soldiers became proof of exactly what Thomas Paine and others had been arguing: that the king viewed Americans not as subjects deserving protection, but as a population to be subdued. Common Sense, published in January of 1776, had already framed the argument in language ordinary people could feel rather than merely understand. The Hessians gave that argument flesh and boots. The British strategy, at least initially, was built around their one genuine advantage. The Royal Navy was the most powerful maritime force on Earth, capable of projecting force against any coastal city in America virtually at will. The plan favored by the High Command involved using that naval superiority to seize and hold key ports, strangling colonial commerce and isolating revolutionary centers from one another. Commanding this effort were two brothers. Admiral Richard Howe controlled the fleet. His brother, General William Howe, commanded the land forces. Together they carried both military authority and, unusually, a peace commission, formal powers to negotiate with the colonists and offer terms. It was a pairing that reflected London's enduring ambivalence: the belief that force and reconciliation could somehow be administered simultaneously. That ambivalence did not survive the summer of 1776. On the 4th of July, the Continental Congress formally adopted the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson's document did not simply announce a political separation. It provided a philosophical architecture for it, grounding the break not in colonial grievance alone, but in universal principles about human equality and the legitimate basis of government. When Richard Howe learned of the Declaration, he sent a message requesting a conference. The reply was courteous and final. The men he was addressing were no longer colonial representatives. They were citizens of a sovereign nation. There was nothing left to negotiate. The door to reconciliation, always narrower than London had imagined, had closed. The Howe brothers would now have to achieve with muskets and cannon what diplomacy could not. And waiting for them, somewhere in the vast American interior, was a Continental Army that had learned at Lexington and Bunker Hill that the British were not invincible. The Howe brothers struck in August of 1776, and they struck hard, landing more than 30,000 troops on Long Island. They outflanked the Continental Army with a night march through an unguarded pass, routing Washington's forces in a matter of hours. The Battle of Long Island was a masterclass in professional warfare. The British lost fewer than 400 men. The Americans lost more than 1,500, killed, wounded, or captured. Washington escaped across the East River in the night, shrouded in fog, saving his army if not his pride. Over the following weeks, the British pressed forward. Manhattan fell. Then White Plains. Then Fort Washington, where nearly 3,000 Continental soldiers were taken prisoner in a single afternoon. By December of 1776, the Army of the Revolution had shrunk to fewer than 5,000 effective men, ragged, unpaid, and retreating through the frozen fields of New Jersey. Half of them were due to go home when their enlistments expired on the 1st of January. The revolution appeared to be dying not in battle but through simple exhaustion. What saved it was audacity. On the night of December 26th, In a snowstorm so bitter that the Delaware River was choked with ice, Washington loaded what remained of his army into Durham boats and crossed to the New Jersey shore. At dawn, he fell upon a garrison of Hessian soldiers at Trenton, capturing nearly 1,000 men before they could properly respond. A week later, he struck again at Princeton. The victories were modest in military terms. In every other sense, they were enormous. Enlistments were renewed. Recruits appeared. The revolution had found its pulse again. But here was the problem Britain could never quite solve. What precisely did victory look like? William Howe captured Philadelphia in September of 1777, marching into the American capital with polished ceremony. The Continental Congress fled to the countryside. By any conventional measure, this was a decisive achievement. Capitals fell, wars ended. Except this one didn't. Congress reconvened. Washington's army, bloodied but intact after Brandywine and Germantown, withdrew to winter quarters at Valley Forge and waited. The revolution was not headquartered in Philadelphia. It was headquartered in the stubborn persistence of an army that understood its only obligation was to survive. Howe had won the campaign and changed almost nothing. The British command repeatedly placed their faith in Loyalist support to solve this problem. And the Loyalists were real. Perhaps a fifth of the colonial population actively supported the crown, with hundreds of thousands more somewhere between committed patriotism and nervous neutrality. In city after city, Loyalists turned out to welcome British troops, sign oaths of allegiance, and promise to help restore order. The Redcoats would move on, and in their absence, patriot militias returned to settle scores. Loyalty to the crown, it turned out, required a permanent garrison to protect it, and Britain never had enough soldiers to garrison a continent. Every town held, every loyalist protected, required men and resources that could not then be used elsewhere. The arithmetic was unforgiving. Britain could win battles indefinitely. It could not be everywhere at once. By the autumn of 1777, something had shifted. The British were stretched across a coastline thousands of miles long, controlling cities they could not pacify and countryside they could not enter. Washington's army still existed. That single fact, after 18 months of British victories, was perhaps the most significant strategic reality of the entire war. And somewhere to the north, along the upper Hudson Valley, a British general named John Burgoyne was about to demonstrate what happened when that reality was ignored. John Burgoyne was not a man who doubted himself. A celebrated playwright, a member of Parliament, a general with a reputation for dash and style, he arrived in Canada in the spring of 1777 with a plan he had personally presented to King George III in London. It was, on paper, elegant. An army of roughly 8,000 men would drive south from Canada through Lake Champlain, seize the Hudson Valley, and link up with British forces moving north from New York City. The rebellious colonies would be cut in two. New England, the radical heart of the Revolution, would be isolated and strangled. The strategic logic was sound. The execution would prove catastrophic. The first problem was General William Howe. Burgoyne's plan assumed that Howe would send a substantial force north up the Hudson to meet him. Howe, however, had decided to take Philadelphia instead, sailing his army south into the Chesapeake. Historians still argue over who bears responsibility for this fatal miscommunication. Lord George Germain, the minister overseeing the war in London, approved both plans without apparently ensuring they were coordinated. Two armies, moving in opposite directions, each pursuing their own version of victory. Burgoyne pushed south through the summer heat, and at first it went well enough. Fort Ticonderoga fell in early July without a fight. But the wilderness beyond it was another matter entirely. The terrain was brutal, the American militia infuriating, felling trees across roads, destroying bridges, harassing his flanks. By the time Burgoyne reached the Hudson, his supply lines were fraying and his horses and provisions running dangerously short. A foraging expedition to Bennington in August was ambushed and destroyed, costing him nearly 900 men he could not replace. He crossed the Hudson in September, and the trap began to close. Waiting for him near Saratoga was an American force under General Horatio Gates, positioned on high ground above the river, reinforced by militia who understood what was at stake. The first battle, at Freeman's Farm on the 19th of September, was savage and inconclusive, though the Americans inflicted serious casualties. Burgoyne waited 3 weeks for relief from Howe that would never come. On the 7th of October, his second attempt to break through the American lines collapsed under a ferocious counterattack, much of it led by Benedict Arnold, fighting with reckless brilliance before being badly wounded. Surrounded, outnumbered, with no hope of resupply or rescue, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army on the 17th of October, 1777. Nearly 6,000 British and German soldiers laid down their arms. It was the largest surrender of British forces in living memory. The shock in London was profound. Lord North, grasping for a way to stop the bleeding, hurriedly prepared an offer to repeal virtually every tax that had caused the crisis in the first place. If the Americans would simply return to the relationship of 1763, before the Stamp Act, before all of it, Britain would concede the point. It was the peace offer that, offered in 1765, might have changed everything. Offered in the winter of 1777, it arrived too late. Because Saratoga had been watched very carefully in Versailles. France had been quietly supporting the American cause for over a year, funneling weapons, ammunition, and money through a fictitious trading company. But covert support was one thing, an open alliance was another, and France would not risk one unless America could actually win. Saratoga answered that question. On the 6th of February 1778, France and the United States signed a formal treaty of alliance and commerce. France recognized American independence and pledged military support. What had begun as a colonial rebellion was now something else entirely. Britain was no longer fighting its own subjects. It was fighting France, a great power with a global navy, ancient grievances, and the resources to pursue them. The war that British commanders had been slowly failing to end in America would now have to be fought on oceans and in territories stretching from the Caribbean to India. The stakes, already enormous, had just multiplied beyond anything London had originally imagined. France had not forgotten. The humiliation of the 7 Years' War, concluded in 1763, had stripped France of Canada, much of India, and its standing as the dominant power in the Atlantic world. For 15 years, French ministers had watched and waited, rebuilding their navy, restructuring their finances, and nursing a grievance that bordered on obsession. When American colonists first raised their muskets against the crown, Paris saw not a rebellion but an opportunity. The treaty signed in February of 1778 was not, for France, an act of idealism. It was revenge, dressed in the language of liberty. The entry of France transformed the entire strategic geometry of the war at a stroke. Until now, Britain had been suppressing an internal uprising, a police action conducted against its own subjects across a single ocean. Suddenly, it faced a European rival with a battle-hardened fleet, colonial possessions of its own, and every reason to strike wherever Britain was vulnerable. And Britain, stretched across a global empire, was vulnerable in many places. The Caribbean became the immediate flashpoint. The sugar islands of the West Indies, Barbados, Jamaica, Antigua, and the rest, generated more wealth for Britain in a single year than the 13 American colonies combined. Merchants, investors, and members of Parliament understood this arithmetic perfectly. Losing Boston was embarrassing. Losing Barbados was unthinkable. Almost overnight, the Sugar Islands displaced America as the priority. Troops and ships that might have finished the war in the colonies were redirected south to defend plantations and harbors worth far more in cold commercial terms than Philadelphia or New York. Then Spain entered the war in 1779. Madrid had its own ledger of grievances and its own list of prizes. Gibraltar, that rocky fortress at the mouth of the Mediterranean, had been in British hands since 1704, a permanent irritant in the Spanish national consciousness. Spain laid siege to it in the summer of 1779, a siege that would last nearly 4 years. Florida, Minorca, and dominance in the Gulf of Mexico were all Spanish objectives. Britain now fought on a second European front without having settled the first. The Dutch followed in 1780. British seizures of Dutch merchant ships carrying supplies to France had exhausted Amsterdam's patience. The Netherlands entered the war, and with it came a new theater in the East Indies and further pressure on British trade routes that already strained under wartime conditions. Perhaps most damaging of all was what did not happen militarily. In 1780, Catherine the Great of Russia organized a League of Armed Neutrality, drawing in Sweden, Denmark, Prussia, and eventually most of the Baltic powers. The League's purpose was to resist British searches of neutral shipping. It stopped short of open war, but its meaning was unmistakable. Britain had managed to antagonize virtually the entire European state system. An empire that had once led coalitions against France now stood isolated, without a single significant ally on the continent. The scale of what Britain now faced beggared the imagination of those who had dismissed the American trouble as a minor colonial disturbance. From the foggy waters of the English Channel, where French invasion plans were drawn up and quietly shelved, to the sun-bleached harbors of the Caribbean, to the Rock of Gibraltar under Spanish artillery, to the trading posts of West Africa and the contested territories of India, Britain's attention was pulled in every direction at once. The army in America had not grown smaller, but the war around it had grown enormously larger. How Britain would manage this crisis, and what it would ultimately sacrifice to survive it, would define the shape of its empire for the century to come. The sea was where empires were made and unmade. Britain understood this better than any nation on earth. For most of the 18th century, the Royal Navy had been the instrument of British dominance, projecting power from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean, keeping enemies at bay and trade routes open. But by 1778, that dominance was slipping away, and the consequences would prove fatal to the American campaign. The Battle of Ushant, fought in July of 1778 off the coast of Brittany, was the moment Britain's naval supremacy first cracked visibly. Admiral Augustus Keppel commanded 24 ships of the line against a roughly equal French force under the Comte d'Orvilliers. The engagement ended inconclusively, the French fleet escaping intact. No decisive blow was struck. In an earlier era, a British admiral would have been expected to annihilate such an opponent. Instead, the French sailed home undamaged, their fleet preserved, their confidence restored. Britain had lost its first real chance to strangle the war at sea before it spread further. Then came the summer of 1779, and the nightmare scenario that had haunted British strategists for generations. France and Spain combined their fleets into a single armada of 66 ships of the line and sailed it directly toward the English Channel. The English coast lay effectively undefended. Panic spread through coastal towns. The combined fleet outnumbered anything Britain could assemble in home waters, and for several agonizing weeks, invasion seemed genuinely possible. In the end, the Armada achieved nothing. Disease swept through the crowded French and Spanish ships. Supplies ran short. The winds turned uncooperative. The Great Fleet withdrew without landing a single soldier on British soil. But the episode revealed something deeply alarming. Britain could no longer guarantee the waters around its own coastline, let alone the Atlantic supply lines feeding its army in America. Into this crisis stepped Admiral George Rodney, dispatched to the Caribbean in 1780 to defend the Sugar Islands that Parliament valued above almost everything else. Rodney was aggressive where other commanders had been cautious, and he understood that the Caribbean War was in many respects the real war. He relieved the besieged garrison of Gibraltar en route, a considerable feat, and then proceeded to contest French naval power across the West Indies with relentless energy. The Sugar Islands held, at least for now. But holding them required ships, and every ship committed to the Caribbean was a ship absent from American waters. This was the central agony of British naval strategy after 1778. The fleet was not small. Britain possessed more ships of the line than any single rival, but it now faced France, Spain, and the Dutch simultaneously across an ocean stretching from the English Channel to the Bay of Bengal. The mathematics were unforgiving. Too many theaters, too few vessels, and no reliable way to concentrate strength in any one place without abandoning another. The American coastline told this story most plainly. British forces in New York and the southern colonies depended entirely on sea resupply. Without naval superiority in American waters, those armies could be isolated, cut off, and overwhelmed. British commanders on land understood this. They had pleaded repeatedly for naval reinforcement. What they received instead were redirections, delays, and the news that yet another priority had emerged somewhere else on the globe. The empire was not losing the war in America through any single catastrophic battle. It was losing it through accumulation, through the slow bleeding of attention and resources across too many fronts, until the one campaign that had started everything could no longer be adequately sustained. On land in Virginia and the Carolinas, the consequences of that naval overstretch were about to become impossible to ignore. While the American colonies burned and the Royal Navy stretched itself thin across 3 oceans, one small peninsula jutting from southern Spain had become the most contested piece of rock in the world: Gibraltar. Britain had seized it in 1704 during the War of the Spanish Succession, and in the 75 years since, it had grown into something more than a military outpost. It was the lock on the Mediterranean, the gateway through which British power flowed into the wider world. Losing it was unthinkable. Holding it, as events would prove, bordered on the miraculous. When Spain entered the war in 1779, Gibraltar became an immediate obsession. A combined Franco-Spanish force eventually numbering around 40,000 men surrounded a garrison of barely 7,000 defenders under the command of General George Augustus Elliot. Elliot was a spare, disciplined Scotsman who reportedly ate no meat and drank no alcohol, channeling his considerable energies entirely into the art of withstanding punishment. He would need every ounce of that discipline. The siege would last nearly 4 years. The first great crisis came in the winter of 1779 into 80, when the garrison ran desperately short of food and ammunition. Then came the relief that Chapter 14 already touched upon in outline. Admiral Rodney, sailing for the Caribbean, intercepted a Spanish convoy off Cape St. Vincent in January 1780. The engagement became known as the Moonlight Battle, fought after dark in extraordinary conditions, with Rodney capturing or destroying 11 Spanish vessels and breaking through to resupply the desperate garrison. Gibraltar breathed again, though only temporarily. The siege continued. Spanish guns hammered the rock continuously. The defenders replied from their own batteries, and Elliot's engineers carved new gun emplacements directly into the limestone cliffs. Life inside the fortress became a grinding endurance test, measured in rations and incoming artillery rounds. Then, on the 13th of September, 1782, the besiegers launched what they intended as the killing blow. 10 enormous floating batteries, specially constructed and believed to be virtually indestructible, advanced on Gibraltar's harbor walls. Tens of thousands of spectators gathered on the Spanish shore to watch the fortress finally fall. Instead, they watched it burn. Elliot's gunners had heated their cannonballs red hot in specially constructed furnaces. The floating batteries, struck repeatedly by glowing iron, caught fire one by one. By morning, all 10 had been destroyed or abandoned. The grand assault had failed completely. Gibraltar would not fall. When peace negotiations eventually concluded in 1783, Britain surrendered enormous territories across the Atlantic world. But Gibraltar remained British, a fact that the negotiators treated with fierce insistence. The rock had cost immense treasure and 3 years of grinding endurance. Surrendering it alongside America would have felt like a different kind of defeat entirely. And so Britain consoled itself. America was gone, but Gibraltar held, and in the wider contest for global power, that still meant something. While soldiers starved inside Gibraltar and cannon fire echoed across the Atlantic, a different kind of catastrophe was unfolding 8,000 miles away. Britain's position in India, built painstakingly over a century of trading posts and careful diplomacy, was suddenly and violently threatened. The question was not simply whether Britain would profit from India. The question was whether Britain would survive there at all. The man holding that precarious position together was Warren Hastings, Governor-General of Bengal since 1772. Hastings was brilliant, ruthless, and perpetually short of money. The East India Company he served was a commercial enterprise masquerading as a government, collecting taxes, fighting wars, and administering millions of people while answering to shareholders in London. It was a deeply unstable arrangement, and in 1780, it nearly collapsed entirely. The blow came from the southwest. Hyder Ali, the formidable ruler of Mysore, swept into the Carnatic in the summer of 1780 with an army of nearly 90,000 men. His cavalry ravaged the countryside to within sight of Madras itself. Company forces under Colonel William Bailey were caught in the open and destroyed at the Battle of Pollur in September, suffering one of the worst defeats in the company's history. The screams of that disaster reached London just as news arrived from America about the fall of Charleston. Britain was losing on every front simultaneously. What made Hyder Ali genuinely terrifying was his alliance with France. Paris had recognized the opportunity immediately. A French squadron under the brilliant Admiral Pierre de Suffren arrived in the Indian Ocean in 1782, fighting 5 ferocious engagements against the British fleet. Suffren was arguably the most gifted naval commander of his generation, and his campaign was extraordinarily aggressive. He denied the British the easy naval supremacy they had always assumed would protect their coastal settlements. Yet India did not fall. Hyder Ali died of cancer in December 1781, and his son Tipu Sultan, though equally dangerous, never quite maintained the same coalition against the company. Hastings proved a relentless improviser, finding new allies among Indian princes, raising fresh revenues through methods that would later haunt him in a famous parliamentary impeachment trial, and simply refusing to accept that defeat was inevitable. By the time peace returned in 1783, the company had survived, battered but intact. The experience, however, had badly frightened London. An operation this strategically vital could not remain in purely commercial hands. Within a year, the India Act of 1784 placed the company's political and military decisions under direct government supervision for the first time. The seeds of formal crown rule had been quietly planted. India had not been lost alongside America. But the struggle to hold it had revealed something important. Britain's Eastern Empire would require the full weight of the state behind it. That state, emerging from the wreckage of the American War, was already beginning to think about what came next. While Hastings was improvising survival in Bengal, the war that had started everything was reaching its decisive moment. 3,000 miles west of Madras, in the tidewater country of Virginia, the entire American conflict was about to be settled, not by heroism or strategy alone, but by a single question of naval control. By the summer of 1781, Lord Cornwallis had grown impatient with the grinding, inconclusive war in the Carolinas. His solution was audacity. He marched his army north into Virginia, the wealthiest and most populous of the rebel colonies, intending to strangle the revolution at its source. It was bold thinking. It was also, as events would prove, catastrophic. Cornwallis settled his force of roughly 8,000 men at Yorktown, a small tobacco port on the York River Peninsula. He chose it because it offered access to the sea. The Royal Navy, he assumed, would keep him supplied and, if necessary, evacuate him. That assumption rested on Britain's most fundamental strategic belief, that they controlled the Atlantic. In September 1781, that belief died. The French Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse had sailed north from the Caribbean with a fleet of 28 ships of the line, carrying 4,000 French troops and enough naval firepower to change the war entirely. He arrived in the Chesapeake Bay on August 31st. The trap was closing, though Cornwallis could not yet see it. The British fleet under Admiral Thomas Graves arrived to challenge him on September 5th. What followed, the Battle of the Capes, was not a spectacular engagement. It was a frustrating, inconclusive afternoon of cannon fire that lasted barely 2 hours of serious combat. But the outcome was devastating. Graves could not break through. He withdrew to New York to refit. When he returned, de Grasse was still there, reinforced, and the Chesapeake was sealed. For the first time in the war, Britain had lost command of the sea at precisely the point where it mattered most. George Washington and the French commander Rochambeau moved their combined army south at remarkable speed, completing a march of 400 miles in just over a month. By late September, more than 16,000 Allied troops surrounded Yorktown. Cornwallis had fewer than 8,000 men, dwindling supplies, and no prospect of relief. He had written to his commander in New York, Henry Clinton, pleading for rescue. The rescuers would not come in time. The siege was methodical and merciless. French and American artillery opened fire on October 9th, and the bombardment intensified over the following days. British positions crumbled one by one. A desperate British attempt to evacuate across the York River on October 16th was scattered by a sudden storm. There was nowhere left to go. On October 19th, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. He could not bring himself to attend in person, pleading illness and sending a subordinate to hand over his sword. The band, so the story goes, played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." Whether the music was literal or legend, the sentiment was exact. When the news reached London, Lord North, the Prime Minister who had managed this long and ruinous war, received it with the kind of despair that needs no translation across centuries. "Oh God," he reportedly said, pacing the room, "it is all over." He was right about America. But whether it was truly all over for Britain was a question that diplomats, strategists, and a quietly ambitious empire would spend the next decade answering. North was right that it was over. But what exactly had been lost? That question consumed London through the bitter winter of 1781 into 1782. North's government, already exhausted and discredited, could not survive Yorktown's verdict. In March of 1782, after 12 years in power, he resigned. The Marquess of Rockingham, leader of the Whigs who had long opposed the war, stepped in to do what North could not: begin the painful work of making peace. But before the diplomats could settle anything, the admirals had one more argument to make. In April of 1782, the British fleet under Admiral George Rodney intercepted the French Caribbean squadron near a chain of small islands called the Saintes, between Guadeloupe and Dominica. What followed was one of the most complete naval victories of the entire war. Rodney shattered the French fleet, captured the flagship Ville de Paris, and took the French Admiral de Grasse himself prisoner. The man who had sealed Yorktown now sat in a British cabin as a captive. The victory came too late to save America, but it sent an unmistakable message to the peace negotiations already beginning in Paris. Britain was not a broken power. It was a wounded one. The difference mattered enormously. The negotiations that produced the Treaty of Paris were a masterwork of division. Britain's chief aim was simple and cynical: separate the Americans from their French and Spanish allies before they could present a united front. The Continental Congress had promised France it would not negotiate independently. The American commissioners, led by Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, broke that promise anyway. They suspected, correctly, that French interests did not perfectly align with American ones, and that a separate deal with Britain might yield better terms. They were right. The treaty, signed in September of 1783, gave the Americans everything they had fought for and more. Britain recognized full independence. American territory extended not merely along the Atlantic seaboard but westward to the Mississippi River, a breathtaking concession that doubled the size of the new nation. Fishing rights off Newfoundland were secured. The terms were so generous that they astonished European observers. Why had Britain given so much? The answer lay in what Britain was protecting elsewhere. By treating America generously, Britain drove a wedge between the new republic and France, leaving France and Spain to negotiate separately from a weaker position. And those separate negotiations told a different story. France gained little beyond what it had spent enormous treasure and blood to acquire. Spain recovered Minorca and Florida, but the one prize it craved above all others remained stubbornly British. Gibraltar, besieged for nearly 4 years, had not fallen. It would not be surrendered. The rock stayed British, as it remains today. Canada stayed British. The Caribbean islands that mattered most stayed British. And far to the east, beyond the reach of the Paris negotiations entirely, India stayed British. Warren Hastings had held the subcontinent through the darkest years of the war, and no treaty signed in a Parisian salon could undo that. The empire had entered the American crisis as a sprawling, confident Atlantic power. It emerged from that crisis having lost its most populous colonies, certainly, but having retained its naval capacity, its commercial networks, its Caribbean sugar wealth, and its foothold on the Indian subcontinent. The loss was real. The humiliation was genuine. And yet the reckoning, for those willing to look clearly, revealed something unexpected. Britain had not been broken. It had been redirected. And the direction it would now travel was one the architects of American independence could never have anticipated. The doomsayers had been so confident. For decades before the Revolution, British politicians and pamphleteers had warned that without the American colonies, the mother country faced inevitable decline. The colonies consumed British manufactured goods. They supplied raw materials. They fed the merchant marine with cargo and the Royal Navy with sailors. Lose them, the argument went, and you lose everything built upon them. Then Britain lost them. And something unexpected happened. Within a decade of the Treaty of Paris, Anglo-American trade had not merely recovered, it had surpassed its pre-war levels entirely. By the early 1790s, American merchants were buying more British cloth, more British ironware, more British finished goods than they ever had as colonial subjects bound by the Navigation Acts. The very regulations designed to capture that trade had, it turned out, been strangling it. Free from imperial restriction, both economies breathed deeper and bought more. How could this be? The mercantilist framework that had governed British imperial thinking for a century held that wealth was fixed, that trade was a competition with winners and losers, and that political control of a territory was the only reliable guarantee of its commercial value. The colonies existed to serve the mother country. Without control, the logic ran, the benefit would vanish. But a Scottish economist had anticipated exactly this failure of imagination, and he had published his argument in a remarkable coincidence of timing. In 1776, the very year the Americans declared their independence, Adam Smith released The Wealth of Nations. His argument was patient, meticulous, and devastating to the old assumptions. Nations grew wealthy not through hoarding trade behind political walls, but through the free exchange of goods wherever comparative advantage led. Restricting trade to benefit one party ultimately impoverished both. Smith had even addressed the American crisis directly, suggesting that if the empire could not be reformed into a genuine free trading partnership, it might be better to let the colonies go. Events proved him right almost immediately. The Americans, now free to trade with whomever they chose, consistently chose Britain. They knew British goods. They trusted British credit. They shared a language, a legal tradition, and commercial habits built over a century and a half. Political separation had not severed those ties. It had, in a strange way, simplified them, stripping away the resentment and the restriction in a single stroke. For thoughtful observers in London, the lesson was uncomfortable but impossible to ignore. Political control was not necessary for profit. An independent nation could be commercially dependent. The flag did not need to fly over a territory for British merchants to dominate its markets. This realization did not immediately transform British policy. Habits of imperial thinking died slowly, and the mercantilist instinct would survive in various forms for decades. But a seed had been planted. A new framework was beginning to take shape, one that would eventually be called liberal imperialism. Trade, not governance, would be its organizing principle. Commerce, not conquest, its primary instrument. Influence, not annexation, its preferred method wherever possible. Britain was learning, slowly and imperfectly, that an empire of markets could outlast and outperform an empire of territories. The American experience had not destroyed British commercial power. It had, paradoxically, helped clarify what that power actually rested upon. And that clarification would prove enormously consequential. Because even as Britain absorbed this lesson in the West, it was building something altogether more direct in the East, where the questions of trade and governance, profit and control, were about to be answered very differently indeed. But there was one problem that free trade theory could not solve. What do you do with your criminals? Before 1783, Britain had a simple answer. For decades, tens of thousands of convicted felons had been shipped across the Atlantic to the American colonies, where they labored on plantations and frontier farms, far from English streets and English property. Transportation, as it was called, cleared the prisons and supplied colonial labor in a single transaction. It was efficient, brutal, and entirely dependent on American cooperation. American independence ended that arrangement overnight. The former colonies had no interest in receiving Britain's convicts, and Britain suddenly had nowhere to send them. The prisons overflowed. Rotting hulk ships moored along the Thames were converted into floating jails, disease-ridden and overcrowded. By the mid-1780s, the crisis was acute. Something had to be done, and it had to be done far away. Into this urgent problem stepped Joseph Banks, the naturalist who had sailed with Captain Cook to the Pacific 17 years earlier. Banks had walked the shores of a place Cook had named Botany Bay on the southeastern coast of New Holland. The vast landmass Europeans had barely begun to understand. The soil was workable. Fresh water was available. And it was, crucially, approximately as far from Britain as it was possible to get on the surface of the earth. Banks made his case to a parliamentary committee in 1779, and his recommendation gathered force with every year the hulks grew more crowded. On the 13th of May, 1787, 11 ships slipped out of Portsmouth Harbor carrying roughly 1,400 people, soldiers, sailors, officials, and 778 convicted men and women whose crimes ranged from highway robbery to stealing a length of ribbon. The First Fleet, as history would name it, faced 8 months at sea, crossing the Atlantic, rounding the Cape of Good Hope, and pushing east across the southern Indian Ocean toward a continent most of them could not have located on a map. On the 26th of January, 1788, Governor Arthur Phillip raised the British flag at a small cove he named Sydney, judging it more suitable than Botany Bay itself. A prison colony had been founded. A continent had been claimed. And an empire had found its replacement. The symmetry was not lost on contemporaries. As the Atlantic door closed, a Pacific door opened. The loss of 13 colonies in the West had, within 5 years, pushed Britain toward a landmass vastly larger than all of them combined. Australia would eventually yield wool, gold, and wheat in quantities that dwarfed anything the American colonies had ever produced. It was an extraordinary pivot, accidental in its origins, enormous in its consequences. Britain had not planned to colonize Australia. It had simply run out of room for its criminals, and the world was very large. The Pacific was opening, and Britain was only beginning to understand what that meant. If the Pacific was one answer to imperial overreach, India was quite another. Here the lesson was not about where to expand, but how to govern what Britain already possessed before it slipped away the same way America had. The East India Company had been trading on the subcontinent since 1600. For nearly 2 centuries it operated as a commercial enterprise, buying and selling cloth, spices, and saltpeter. But war, rivalry, and the collapse of the Mughal Empire had transformed it into something far stranger. A private corporation governing tens of millions of people, maintaining its own army, collecting taxes, and waging campaigns across an entire subcontinent. No parliament had authorized this. No crown minister was accountable for it. A company of merchants had acquired an empire by accident, and almost nobody in London quite knew what to do about it. America had made the answer clear. You govern before you lose. In 1784, William Pitt the Younger pushed through the India Act, one of the most consequential pieces of legislation in British imperial history. The act did not abolish the company. It did something more subtle and more durable. It created a board of control staffed by crown ministers that would oversee all political and military decisions in India while leaving the company's commercial operations nominally intact. For the first time, British India had a chain of accountability leading back to Parliament. The lesson of America, that sovereignty could not be delegated indefinitely to unaccountable bodies, had been absorbed and applied. But legislation alone could not clean up the mess the company had made. For that, Parliament reached for a curious instrument: the trial of Warren Hastings, the company's Governor General, who had administered Bengal through some of its most turbulent years. In 1788, Edmund Burke rose in the House of Commons and delivered an impeachment case of extraordinary rhetorical force, accusing Hastings of corruption, cruelty, and the systematic plunder of Indian society. The trial would drag on for 7 years and ultimately end in acquittal. Yet the acquittal almost missed the point. The trial itself was the message. The empire was placing itself under moral scrutiny. India was not simply a resource to be extracted. It was a responsibility, and that responsibility would be enforced. Then came the most quietly remarkable appointment in the story of British India. In 1786, the Crown sent a new Governor-General to Calcutta to implement Pitt's reforms. His name was Charles Cornwallis, the same Cornwallis who had surrendered his sword at Yorktown 5 years earlier. Here was history reshaping its own cast of characters. The man who had lost America was sent to save India. Cornwallis proved ruthless and effective. He restructured the company's administration, separated civil from military authority, purged corruption from local government, and established a legal code that imposed British standards on Indian administration. He was building not a trading post, but a state, a subordinate state, bound to the crown. By the time Cornwallis left India in 1793, the outlines of what would become the Raj were already visible. The East India Company still existed, still carried its ledgers and traded its goods. But beneath that commercial shell, the machinery of territorial empire was humming, accountable to London, expanding year by year, drawing more of the subcontinent into its orbit. Britain had learned its lesson. Colonies needed governance. Governance required oversight. And oversight, ultimately, meant the crown. The commercial empire of the 17th century was becoming something altogether different. What that something would eventually look like at its full, extraordinary extent is where this story turns next. While Cornwallis was rebuilding British India's foundations, Europe was tearing itself apart. In 1789, France exploded. What began as a fiscal crisis became a revolution. And what became a revolution became something the old world had never quite seen before. A nation in arms, exporting its ideology at bayonet point across an entire continent. For Britain, the French Revolutionary Wars beginning in 1793 were not simply another round of the old dynastic rivalry. They were an existential contest, and this time, Britain would not repeat the mistakes of 1778. The Royal Navy that faced France in the 1790s was a different instrument from the one that had fumbled at Chesapeake Bay. The dockyards at Portsmouth and Plymouth had been overhauled. Copper sheathing on hulls, a technology proven in the American War, now allowed British warships to sail faster and stay at sea longer without the crippling weed and barnacle growth that had plagued earlier fleets. Admiral Richard Kempenfeld's signal system, refined and standardized, meant that British captains could maneuver in concert rather than groping through smoke and confusion. The Navy had studied its failures and answered them with engineering and discipline. The results were systematic and sweeping. As France and its revolutionary armies overran the Netherlands, Spain, and much of continental Europe, Britain moved quietly but relentlessly to harvest their overseas empires. The Cape Colony, which controlled the sea route to Asia, fell to British forces in 1795. Ceylon followed, Trinidad, Tobago, Martinique, and a string of Caribbean islands changed hands. Dutch possessions in the East Indies came under British administration. One by one, the maritime assets of defeated or occupied European powers were absorbed into a growing British network of bases, harbors, and coaling stations stretching from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. Then came October the 21st, 1805. Off Cape Trafalgar on the Spanish coast, Admiral Horatio Nelson met the combined French and Spanish fleets and destroyed them. Nelson died in the victory, but the strategic consequence outlasted mourning. No naval power on Earth could now seriously threaten British control of the seas. Not for a century would anyone come close. Napoleon could dominate Europe's landmass, but he could never reach beyond it. Britain's commerce flowed uninterrupted. Her colonies remained secure. her enemies suffocated. When Napoleon finally fell and the great powers gathered at the Congress of Vienna in 1814 and 1815, Britain arrived not as a supplicant, but as the indispensable victor. She took Cape Colony permanently, kept Ceylon and Malta, secured Mauritius and Heligoland, and emerged with a string of strategic possessions that girdled the entire globe. The Second British Empire had arrived, larger and more coherently organized than the first, built not on colonial settlement alone, but on maritime supremacy, strategic bases, and the hard-won lessons of American defeat. What remained was the question of what to do with so much power, and so many millions of people now living under its shadow. What, then, had Britain actually learned from the catastrophe of American independence? The answer took decades to fully articulate, but when it finally arrived, it came in the form of a single remarkable document. In 1837, rebellions broke out in both Upper and Lower Canada. They were small affairs, quickly suppressed, but to attentive minds in London they carried an unmistakable echo. Here again were colonists with legitimate grievances about self-governance, colonists who felt their voices carried no weight with distant administrators. The colonial secretary Lord Melbourne dispatched John Lambton, the Earl of Durham, to investigate. Durham was difficult, brilliant, and impatient with comfortable fictions. His report, published in 1839, delivered a verdict that no British official had quite dared to write before. Give them responsible government, Durham argued. Let the colonists govern themselves in domestic matters through assemblies accountable to local voters rather than to London. The alternative, he implied, was another America. The logic was elegant and ruthlessly pragmatic. Concede before you lose. Grant autonomy willingly and the empire retains the relationship. Resist until the breaking point, and you lose everything, as Britain had learned at Yorktown. The Durham Report became the constitutional blueprint for a new kind of empire. Canada received responsible government in 1848. The Australian colonies followed through the 1850s, New Zealand shortly after, and South Africa, despite the violent interruption of the Boer War by 1910. Each transition followed a recognizable pattern. Settler populations pushed for greater control. London calculated the cost of resistance, and self-governance was extended before frustration could harden into rebellion. The critical phrase, however, is settler populations. The lesson Britain absorbed from America was applied generously and swiftly to colonies where the majority population was white and British in origin. It was applied slowly, reluctantly, and often only under enormous pressure everywhere else. India, Nigeria, Kenya, the Caribbean islands. These places waited far longer for the same logic to reach them. The principle of devolution as imperial strategy turned out to be racially selective in its timing. And yet the principle, once established, proved impossible to permanently contain. The same argument that justified Canadian self-rule in 1848 could not be indefinitely refused to Indians or Africans or West Indians. Nationalist movements across the 20th century would invoke Durham's logic against Britain itself, demanding only what Britain had already conceded to others. The result was the Commonwealth, a voluntary association of independent nations retaining symbolic ties to the British Crown, a structure that allowed the empire to dissolve without admitting outright defeat. It was perhaps the most graceful exit from global dominance that history has recorded. The 13 colonies had not simply broken away. They had taught Britain how to let go, and that lesson, slowly and imperfectly applied, would quietly dismantle the very empire their rebellion had helped to build. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris confirmed what Yorktown had already decided. Britain lost 13 colonies containing roughly 2.5 million people. It seemed, to many at the time, like the beginning of the end. It was, in fact, the beginning of something else entirely. Within a century of that defeat, The British Empire had grown to encompass roughly a quarter of the Earth's land surface and govern 400 million people. The map that had shrunk along the Atlantic coast exploded outward across India, across Africa, across the Pacific. The loss of America did not hollow out the empire. It forced a reckoning that made the empire, in purely territorial terms, larger than anything Britain's founders had imagined possible. How does a nation lose its greatest colony and then build something so much vaster? The answer lies precisely in what Yorktown destroyed. The old model, governing distant populations without consent, extracting revenue without representation, treating colonies as commercial possessions rather than political communities, had proven catastrophically expensive. Britain did not abandon empire after 1783. It abandoned that particular way of running one. Trade filled the space where territorial control had once stood. The relationship with America itself made the point with quiet eloquence. Within decades of independence, the United States had become Britain's most important trading partner. The guns had barely cooled before the merchant ships resumed their crossings. Commerce, it turned out, did not require flags or governors or garrisons. The two nations that had fought so bitterly for independence from one another grew so economically intertwined that by the 20th century, their fates were effectively inseparable. This is the deepest irony buried inside 1783. Britain lost the argument about sovereignty and won the argument about trade. America became independent and became British in its commercial habits, its legal inheritance, its language, and eventually its strategic alignment. The empire that formally ended at Yorktown continued informally for generations in ledger books and law courts and the shared assumption that the Atlantic world operated according to Anglo-American rules. And then, as the previous chapter traced so carefully, the principle that preserved the empire also dissolved it. Concede before you lose. Grant self-governance before rebellion makes it inevitable. The logic that saved Canada saved Australia and New Zealand, and eventually, under enormous pressure and after unconscionable delay, reached every corner of the empire. What remains, then, of the catastrophe of 1783? A commonwealth of nations, an Anglo-American alliance that shaped 2 world wars, a global legal and commercial order built on British foundations, and the quiet, persistent truth that the most durable empires are not always the ones that hold tightest. Britain lost America and learned, slowly and imperfectly, how to let go of everything else. That lesson, taught at the point of a continental musket in a Virginia field, built the modern world. Britain lost a continent and, in losing it, learned the art of building something far more lasting than territory. Subscribe for more histories of the defeats that quietly shaped our world.